There are nights when nothing looks unusual, and yet one small sound changes the whole direction of a life. For Walter Hayes, it started with a sound most people would have ignored. A thin, broken cry slipping under the back door somewhere between the evening news and the desert stars. He was in the kitchen of his small house on the edge of Pine Hollow, Arizona, rinsing out his coffee mug, letting the day wind down. The TV murmured from the living room, one of those old westerns he could quote by heart. His two cats, Marble and Rusty, were already settling in. Marble perched on the back of the couch, Rusty curled into the warm groove of Walter's empty recliner. Then he heard it again. Not the usual yowl of neighborhood cats arguing over territory. This was higher, thinner, laced with panic. It cut through the quiet like a wire drawn tight. Walter set the mug down, water still running, and stood still for a second. The way he'd been trained to do decades earlier, when you hear something you can't place, you don't rush, you listen. There in the soft hum of the refrigerator, the low murmur of the TV, he heard it for the third time. A cub's cry. He didn't know that yet, but his body reacted before his mind caught up. His knees protested as he turned toward the sliding glass door. The bones in his right hand ached as he pushed it open. The desert air moved in, cool and dry, carrying the smell of dust and faint creosote after a brief afternoon sprinkle. For a moment, the backyard looked exactly like it always did. A patch of gravel, a narrow strip of scrubby grass, the leaning chain-link fence. Beyond that, the land dropped into the shallow drainage ditch that ran behind all the houses on his street, a scar of red dirt and concrete catching the runoff when the monsoon storms rolled through. The sound came again, this time clearly from beyond the fence. Walter's eyes adjusted slowly. Porch light on, motion sensor still. He stepped out in his worn sneakers, one hand automatically sliding along the railing, feeling for steadiness. He wasn't a young man charging down a hill anymore. Each step on the gritty concrete told him that. But the part of him that had once led patrols in the dark was still there, quiet, steady, counting heartbeats. At the fence line, he saw the problem. Two small shapes clung to the crumbling lip of the concrete ditch. Their spotted fur was plastered to their sides, paws scrabbling for purchase. Muddy water swirled below them from the earlier rain. Not deep, but fast enough to pull something small off balance. Their ears were too large for their faces, tips dark, tails short and bobbed, unmistakably wild. Bobcat cubs. Not fairy tales, not cartoons, real desert kittens, too young for this much trouble. One of them slid an inch, claws squealing against the concrete. That brief, strangled cry came out of its throat, and something in Walter's chest answered. Kindness isn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just the refusal to stand there and watch something slip away. He didn't think about keywords or moral stories or how heartwarming this might look on a screen someday. He thought about weight and distance, how far down, how steep, whether their mother might be close. He swept his flashlight beam across the brush. The edges of juniper and scrub glowed, then fell back into shadow. No glowing eyes yet, no sign of a larger cat, but he knew she had to be near. The old chain-link gate creaked as he unlatched it and worked his way around to the access path that led behind the houses. His breathing grew louder in his own ears. The slope down into the ditch was slick, the thin layer of mud turning his worn shoes into skates. He put one hand against the embankment, feeling his shoulder twinge, and took it slow. "Easy," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the cubs or to his own knees. At the edge of the concrete, he saw it clearly. The smaller cub's back paws were already losing their grip, only its front claws keeping it from falling. The second one huddled close, pressed to its sibling, like they were one shaking body. On the narrow strip of dirt beside him lay a weathered length of wood, part of an old pallet that had washed down in some forgotten storm and never made it back up. Walter picked it up, testing its weight. A makeshift bridge. Not regulation, not pretty, but better than nothing. Then the larger one sniffed it, tiny whiskers twitching. It took one cautious step onto the wood, claws clicking softly. The second cub, the one that had cried the loudest, followed, legs shaking. They crossed inches at a time. Walter kept his arms steady, every muscle in his shoulders burning, the ache in his lower back flaring. He had carried gear and men through far worse. But he wasn't that soldier anymore. Every second on that slippery slope reminded him of that truth. When both cubs reached the dirt on his side, they froze, pressed together, sides heaving. Up close, he could see how small they really were. He could smell them, a mix of dust, wild fur, and the sharp edge of fear. "Go on," he whispered. "She's waiting." He backed up slowly, giving them space. A rustle came from the brush above, and then he saw her, an adult bobcat, lean and strong, half-shadowed among the stems. Her eyes found his and held. There was no drama, no roar, no leap, just a long, clear look between two tired creatures who both understood what it meant to be responsible for smaller lives. In that gaze, there was no wild hatred. There was vigilance, yes, a protective kind of loyalty, maybe, if you look closely enough, a flicker of something like recognition. She stepped forward, silent, met her cubs halfway, and nudged them toward the thicker cover. Their spotted bodies vanished into the darkness with her, tails flicking once, like a brief goodbye. Within seconds, the ditch was empty again, as if none of it had happened. Walter stood there, shoes soaked, jeans streaked red with mud, heart still pounding against his ribs. Behind him, the lights of Pine Hollow glowed soft and distant. Somewhere down the street, someone closed a car door. The everyday world was still turning, but in that narrow strip of land between his fence and the wild, something inside him had shifted. He climbed back up slowly, gripping the chain link, breathing deep against the complaint in his lungs. In that climb, there was a quiet truth. Age had taken some speed, but it hadn't taken his capacity for love or the impulse toward kindness. Back on the porch, Marble and Rusty met him at the door, noses twitching at the scent of bobcat on his clothes. He scratched their heads with a muddy hand and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Most people in Pine Hollow would never know that two wild cubs had almost been lost behind their houses that night. Most would never see the way a man in his 70s still moved when lives were on the line. But from that moment on, the backyard was no longer just a patch of gravel and grass. It was a borderland between a quiet human life and a wild world that had chosen to trust him, at least for a night. As we move into the next part of this story, we'll step inside Walter's house and see what kind of loneliness this wild encounter walked into, and why this unexpected visit would become the start of a second life he never saw coming. And if you've ever stood at a window and felt that quiet ache in your own chest, you might want to stay with this story a little longer. Some houses are haunted without a single ghost in them, not by anything dark or frightening, but by the simple fact that love once filled every corner, and now the rooms are doing their best to remember it. Walter Hayes' place in Pine Hollow, Arizona, was like that. From the outside, it looked like 100 other modest homes on the edge of town. Faded stucco, gravel yard. A few stubborn plants are clinging to life near the porch, but step inside, and you could feel it. The soft weight of years lived 2 by 2, now carried by one person, walking a little slower down the hallway. Morning in Walter's house always began the same way. The coffee maker clicked on before the sun cleared the low hills. He'd shuffle into the kitchen in his socks, palm resting on the counter for balance as he waited for that first breath of steam. On the table, a single place setting. The second chair was still there, pulled out just a little, as if someone might sit down any minute. Marble, the quieter cat, would appear first, tail high, hopping up onto the chair that used to be his wife Margaret's. Rusty came next, stretching long, claws rasping softly on the rug before he wound around Walter's ankles. They didn't fill the silence, but they softened it. If you looked around that kitchen, you could read a whole life in small things. Margaret's favorite mug, the one with the hummingbirds, still sat on the shelf. Her gardening gloves hung by the back door, fingers curled in on themselves from the last time she'd used them. On the wall, a calendar frozen on the month she didn't make it past. Walter noticed all of it, every day. Aging hadn't dulled his awareness. If anything, it made every object sharper, heavier, like his heart was a shelf already carrying more than it was built for. He eased himself into his chair with the tiny exhale older people make only when they think they're alone. His knees ached in the cool air. He rubbed the spot under his collarbone where a doctor once tapped and said, "We just keep an eye on things." Beside the salt and pepper sat his pill bottles, lined up like a little platoon. Blood pressure, cholesterol, the ones for sleep he tried not to use. From the living room, the TV flickered to life with a familiar theme song. Old Western. Same channel, same time, every morning. There was comfort in that predictable rhythm. A routine can be its own kind of loyalty, showing up for yourself the same way long after the world has stopped organizing around you. On the counter, his phone buzzed. A voicemail light blinked. He knew who it was. His daughter, far away in another state, with a life full of late shifts and school pickups and traffic. He loved her deeply. He was proud of her. But the space between their worlds had stretched over the years, thin and taut like an old rope. He pressed play. "Hey, Dad. Just calling to check in. I'm sorry I missed you again. Things are busy. I'll try to call when I'm not rushing. I love you." There was a pause at the end of the message, the kind you only catch when you're listening in a quiet house. He could hear it, the wish, the guilt, the hurry. He stared at the screen as it asked if he wanted to call back. His thumb hovered over the button. Then he set the phone down and took a sip of coffee instead. Not because he didn't want to talk, because some part of him still believed that love meant not bothering people, not adding to anyone's load. Many folks his age know that feeling intimately. The way you talk yourself out of reaching for connection, even when your heart is aching for it. In another life, in a younger body, Walter had been the one people depended on. An infantryman, a protector. He used to walk the perimeter at night, checking fences and lines, counting heads. There was always someone to watch over, some mission to prepare for. Now, his perimeter was the narrow stretch of backyard behind his house. His watch list had shrunk to 2 old cats, a few tomato plants, and the creak of the fence in strong wind. And yet, the instincts remained. When he made his slow rounds from kitchen to living room, he still scanned windows like he was watching for movement. When he locked the front door at night, he double-checked the latch with the same precision he once used on equipment in the dark. Duty doesn't always disappear when the job ends. Sometimes it just sits there, waiting to be given to something new. Marble jumped into his lap, heavy in that comforting way cats can be. Rusty took his usual spot by the window, nose pressed to the glass. Walter stroked Marble's fur, absent-minded, eyes on the muted TV. But his thoughts weren't with the cowboy on the screen. They were with Margaret. He saw her not as a ghost, but as a series of small, living moments. She bent over the sink, rinsing strawberries. She laughed at Rusty's first clumsy leap. Her standing in this same kitchen, hands on her hips, insisting they put out water for the stray cats that crossed the yard. "You can't save them all," he'd told her once. "I know," she'd said, pouring fresh water anyway. "But we can be kind to the ones that cross our little piece of earth." He didn't realize how much that simple sentence had lodged itself in him until the night he pulled those bobcat cubs from the ditch. It had felt less like a heroic rescue and more like continuing a conversation she started years ago. In that sense, the house was haunted, but softly, kindly. Every corner held echoes of small kindnesses, of quiet love. It made his solitude feel both heavier and more meaningful. He wasn't just living alone. He was living with the weight of a story that hadn't fully ended. For some people, moral stories and inspirational stories are big, dramatic things. For Walter, they were these little moments. Picking up a dropped pill instead of ignoring it. Choosing to answer the neighbor's wave from across the street. Refilling the birdbath out back, even when his back hurt. They weren't loud, but they were loyal. They were his way of staying in a relationship with a world that had changed faster than his heart could keep up. The night he rescued the bobcat cubs didn't erase any of this. it slid into place among them. Now, the cats sniffed that spot every morning, whiskers twitching at the lingering wild scent. The house, once haunted only by memory, now carried the trace of something untamed too. That combination of grief and wildness, of aging bones and young paws, created a different kind of fairy tale. And somehow still receives something back. As Walter sat at his table, sipping lukewarm coffee, phone face down beside him, he had no idea how deeply the presence of those bobcats would begin to change his days. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, he had a reason to check the backyard with more than habit. In the next part of this story, we'll walk out that back door with him, into the red dirt and the thin desert light, and see the first signs that his ordinary yard is about to become the crossing point between a quiet human life and a wild family searching for safety. Some truths don't arrive as big revelations. They start as a few small marks in the dirt that only someone paying attention would ever notice. 3 mornings after Walter pulled those bobcat cubs out of the drainage ditch, he stepped onto his back porch with his coffee and saw something that made him stop mid-step. Right there, in the soft red dust between the concrete and the fence, were tracks. Not the neat circles his house cats left. These were bigger in front, narrower behind. You could see the pad, the faint outline of toes, but no claw marks. Whatever had walked there the night before moved light and sure, like it knew this ground better than he did. He lowered himself slowly onto the porch chair, knees complaining, coffee cooling in his hand, and just looked. The tracks came up along the fence line, paused at the spot where he usually stood at dusk, then turned toward the corner of the yard where the desert scrub pressed closest. He could picture it. A bobcat, maybe the mother of those cubs, pacing out her own perimeter under the stars while he slept under the same roof as always. Assumes life was back to normal. It wasn't. Inside, Marble paced along the sliding glass door, tail twitching. Rusty stayed further back, eyes wide, body low. Animals have their own wordless ways of telling us when the world has shifted. You could feel it in the room. An invisible line had been crossed between once-in-a-lifetime rescue and they're still here. Later that day, with the sun high and the air moving in shimmering waves over the gravel, Walter did something that tells you a lot about who he was. He didn't pick up the phone to complain. He picked it up to ask how to do the right thing. He scrolled to a number he hadn't used in years. Caleb Morgan, the local wildlife officer. They'd met long ago at a community talk about living alongside mountain lions. Walter remembered the way Caleb spoke, not in scare tactics, not in fairy tales, but in calm, practical terms about respect and boundaries. "Caleb, it's Walter Hayes in Pine Hollow," he said when the line connected. "Listen, I think I've got bobcats using the drainage out back. A mother and at least 2 cubs. I pulled the little ones out of the ditch the other night." Caleb's response came with a soft chuckle of surprise. "You've had an interesting week, Mr. Hayes." They talked for a while. Walter described the tracks, the ditch, and the scrub. Caleb didn't rush him. He listened, then laid out the facts in plain language. Bobcats are shy by nature, mostly active around dawn and dusk. They cover a lot of ground. They matter more than most people realize. They keep rodent numbers down, keep small ecosystems in balance. He also made something else clear. They're still wild. It's not safe to treat them like pets or to lure them close on purpose. If you feel threatened, if they're acting strangely, you call me. But if they're just passing through, the best kindness is distance and removing dangers. Walter absorbed every word. It wasn't a dramatic lecture. It was a small, important reminder that love and loyalty don't always mean stepping in more. Sometimes they mean stepping back, just enough. After he hung up, he stood a long time at the sliding door looking out at his yard with new eyes. This wasn't just his space anymore. That afternoon, when the worst of the heat finally bled out of the sky, he walked the perimeter of his fence as he had once walked the boundaries of camps and outposts. This time, he wasn't checking for enemies. He was looking for hazards. He found an old section of rusted wire half buried behind the shed, sticking up at just the right height to catch a small paw or leg. He pulled it free, inch by inch, feeling the strain in his back as he straightened it out and coiled it for the trash. Near the raised beds, he spotted plastic netting sagging low, brittle from the sun. He remembered how easily a panicked animal could tangle itself in something like that. It would have been simpler to leave it. Instead, he cut it down, rolled it up, and leaned it against the wall to be dealt with later. From the outside, he probably looked like an old man puttering in his yard. On the inside, something more soulful was happening. This was kindness as quiet work, love expressed through hammer swings and careful steps, loyalty to creatures who didn't even know his name. That evening, just after the light tipped from gold to blue, Walter got the confirmation he didn't know he was waiting for. He stood at the back door, lights off behind him, eyes adjusted to the growing dark. The desert settled into its nighttime sounds. Cicadas, a dog barking in the distance, a train horn far away. And then, near the far corner of the fence, movement. She stepped out from the brush with the unhurried grace of something that has survived a long time by not wasting effort. The bobcat. Luna, that's what he would call her later, crossed his yard without looking up at the house. Her body was compact and strong, fur a blend of tawny browns and faint spots that caught the last scraps of light. She padded to the corner where the scrub grew thickest and disappeared. Walter frowned, leaning closer. There was no hole in the fence he could see, no obvious path, just a tangle of juniper and desert grass. He waited. A moment later, he saw them. Two tiny faces peeking from an opening under the lowest branches, eyes bright, ears tipped dark. The cubs he'd pulled from the ditch now nestled in a shallow hollow in his back corner, a natural shelter scraped out of dust and roots. A den. Not miles away in some untouched wilderness, not on the other side of town. Right there, in the place he'd mowed and watered and walked 1,000 times without knowing what lived just on the other side of his awareness. He watched as Luna bent to them, touching each small head in turn with her nose. One cub batted clumsily at her chin. Another tried to pounce on her tail and almost toppled over. It was a simple scene, no narration needed, yet it carried the weight of everything. Survival, tenderness, the relentless push of life forward, even in dry, unforgiving places. Standing there in the semi-dark, Walter felt something stir that he hadn't felt in a long while. A sense of belonging. Not just to his house or his habits, but to a stretch of land that was alive in ways he'd never fully seen. And now came the part that could have gone very differently. He knew, from Caleb and from common sense, that he had choices. He could call and ask for the family to be relocated. He had every right to insist that wild animals had no place this close to his yard, his cats, his routines. Many people would have. Fear and control are understandable reactions. Instead, he took a slower breath and asked himself a quieter question. What if I learned to share this space? He thought about Margaret watering stray cats from an old dish, saying, "We can be kind to the ones that cross our little piece of earth." He thought about those cubs last week, claws scraping concrete, and the way his hands moved without hesitation. In that moment, his decision wasn't grand or cinematic. It was simple and firm. He would leave the den alone. He would walk his yard with more care. He would keep Marble and Rusty indoors during those twilight hours. He would let this bobcat family stay as long as they needed, so long as everyone could be safe. It was a small act of trust that would ripple much farther than he could see from that porch. From here on, the backyard wasn't just a backdrop for his days. It was going to be the center of a heartwarming, almost unbelievable connection. A living, breathing, inspirational story about loyalty between species, about the way wildness and aging and love can all coexist in one quiet Arizona lot. In the next part, we'll see how Walter's old training and this new responsibility start to weave together, turning his retired life into something like a second mission he never signed up for, but was perfectly built for. And if you've ever looked out at a familiar patch of ground and wondered what else might be sharing it with you, this is where the story begins to answer that in the gentlest way. Some missions never come with orders, medals, or uniforms. They arrive quietly, in the shape of paw prints, and an old habit in your chest that still refuses to look away when someone small might need you. After Walter found the bobcat den in his back corner and chose not to push the wild family away, something in him clicked into place. He didn't say it out loud, but every morning after that, he woke up like a man reporting for duty. Only this time, the outpost was his backyard. He started the day the same way he always had. Coffee, pills, a slow stretch of his back while Marble and Rusty circled his feet. But there was a new step now. Before the first sip, he slid the back door open and stepped out into the cool air, letting his eyes travel the same path they once did on foreign soil. Fence line, juniper corner, drainage ditch. He wasn't checking for enemies anymore. He was checking for signs of life. Fresh tracks in the red dirt, disturbed gravel near the den, a new bend in the grass where a bobcat might have slipped through in the night. The old army training, scan, assess, move, was still there. It just had a gentler purpose now. On the little table by the door, he kept a spiral notebook and a ballpoint pen. Each morning and evening he wrote simple lines. Bobcat seen 6:12 a.m. moving east. 2 cubs out at dusk practicing pounce. Male appeared on the fence, drove off the stray dog. The handwriting shook a little more than it used to, but the loyalty behind it was the same. For a man who once recorded troop movements and supply counts, these notes were a new kind of logbook. Small pieces of a heartwarming story he was slowly realizing he was part of. One afternoon, the weather radio crackled with a storm warning. Heavy rain was on its way, the kind that could turn the drainage ditch into a temporary river. Walter looked out at the shallow slope where he'd first pulled the cubs to safety and imagined that scene playing out again. But worse. He set his jaw and went to the shed. The tools weren't fancy. A handsaw, a small hammer, a bucket of bent nails. He straightened one by one on the workbench. He found 3 decent planks and carried them out, one at a time, to the stretch of ground between his yard and the ditch. Every step down that slope lit up his knees and hips, but he kept going, looking to himself the way he'd once talked to young soldiers who were just learning how to push through discomfort. "This doesn't have to be pretty," he murmured, lining the boards up across the low spot. "It just has to hold." By the time the clouds rolled in over Pine Hollow, a simple wooden walkway sat 6 inches above the worst of the mud, anchored into more solid ground. It wasn't much, a rough little bridge made of scrap wood and stubbornness, but in his mind, it was a field fix. The same instinct that had once built crossings for trucks and men was now building a path for a wild mother and her cubs. That night, rain drummed on the roof, wind rattled the gate. From his bedroom window, he could just make out the pale shape of the walkway and the flashes of lightning. He lay awake longer than he meant to, listening. You don't completely retire from listening for trouble. You just don't wear the uniform anymore. Near midnight, he saw movement. A small shape darted across the bridge, then another. A larger form followed, low and steady. For a fleeting second, lit by the quicksilver of lightning, he saw Luna's outline. Head low, body moving with purpose, as she guided her family across the high ground he'd laid down. It wasn't dramatic. They were there, and then gone, swallowed by the dark. But his chest tightened with something that felt a lot like the old days, when a plan held, and everyone made it back to camp. The next morning, he stepped out to find the wood damp but intact, tiny muddy paw prints dotting its length. His joints complained as he crouched to touch them. There was a strange, quiet joy in knowing those marks were there because he'd gotten up and done the work, even when nobody was watching. This became his second mission. Protect, but don't possess. Help, but don't interfere more than needed. He remembered Caleb's words about bobcat behavior, how they preferred dawn and dusk, how they kept rodent populations in check, how they didn't want to be our pets. Walter took that seriously. He stopped leaving any food outside that might confuse the lines. Marble and Rusty ate indoors now. He secured the trash lids with bungee cords, so no easy meals would encourage bad habits. Instead of baiting the bobcats closer, he focused on removing dangers. Loose wire, broken boards, anything a small paw could get hung up in. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel affection growing. Watching the cubs play tested something in his chest he thought had gone numb. Clover, the smallest, liked to stalk grasshoppers and then jump back in surprise when they flew. Birch moved more slowly, testing every step before he took it. Each one carried its own little spark of personality. On the worst nights, when old memories came back, the sound of a radio cutting out mid-sentence, the echo of boots running toward something they couldn't see, he found himself stepping onto the porch, breathing in the desert air, and looking toward the den. One evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, he watched Bridger, the male bobcat, patrol the fence line. A stray dog had wandered too close, ribcage showing, nose to the ground. Without a sound, Bridger appeared on the low cinder block wall and moved forward in a slow, deliberate line. No theatrics, no needless violence, just a firm, clear message. This space is taken. The dog caught the scent, glanced up, and backed off with a whine. Bridger watched until the intruder had trotted down the wash, then turned and melted back toward the junipers. It was a wild version of the work Walter had done his whole life. Hold the line, keep the vulnerable safe. Standing there with his hand on the sliding door, Walter felt something he hadn't put words to in a long time. Pride. Not in himself, exactly, but in the way love and loyalty were playing out here in this unlikely fairy tale. An old soldier and a bobcat father, both tending to their own kind in the ways they come. Knew how. It was also about him being rescued from feeling useless, from thinking his days of service were behind him. The mission had changed shape. That was all. Protecting a wild family he was never supposed to meet gave a new rhythm to his days, a reason to stretch a little farther, walk the fence even when his ankles ached, and keep his notebook up to date. It was soon this careful distance between his side of the glass and their side of the fence would start to dissolve. The wild wouldn't just stay in the corner near the junipers. It would start coming closer, to the back steps, to the porch, to the very place where he drank his morning coffee. In the next part, we'll sit with Walter on that porch as Clover inches nearer, as Marble and Rusty learn to share sunlight with a bobcat cub, and as the first hints of a wider community begin to stir around this unlikely backyard peace. If some part of you still feels that old instinct to look after others, even now, you might find comfort in how this story continues. Some visits don't begin with a knock on the door. They start with a shape in the corner of your eye, lying very still, as if the wild itself has decided to sit and wait until you're ready to notice it. It happened for Walter on a pale, quiet morning in late summer. He stepped into his usual routine. Coffee in the same chipped mug, pill bottles lined up by the sink, Marble and Rusty padding ahead of him toward the sliding glass door. The house sounded like it always did at that hour. Refrigerator humming, TV off, a faint buzz from the streetlights outside. He slid the curtain back and froze. Just outside the glass, on the warm concrete of the back step, a small bobcat cub was curled up, paws tucked under her chest, eyes half closed. Clover. She wasn't pressed against the door. She wasn't begging for food. She'd chosen a respectful distance, far enough to escape if she needed to, close enough to see in. Between them, a pane of glass, a thin strip of air, and a world of difference in how both of them were used to living. For a long moment, nobody moved. Marble hopped up onto the inside window ledge, settling into a mirror image of Clover's posture. Rusty sat by Walter's ankle, tail wrapped around his paws, staring. Walter held his coffee with both hands, feeling the warmth against his fingers and the faint, steady thump of his heart. There was no growl, no hiss, just 3 pairs of eyes sharing the same quiet morning. On any other day, he might have turned on the TV, drowned the silence with talking heads and breaking news that had nothing to do with his little patch of earth. But something about that bobcat's calm presence held him there. He set his coffee down, reached for a sticky note from the pad on the counter, and almost without thinking, wrote 2 simple words. "Morning, little one." He smoothed the note onto the glass at her eye level. Clover blinked slowly, head tilting just a fraction. She couldn't read it, of course, but there was something undeniably soulful in the way her gaze rested on that small square of yellow, then lifted to his face. Kindness doesn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like a man in his 70s putting a greeting on a door for a wild creature that will never know his language, but might feel his intention. That was the first visit. It wasn't the last. Clover didn't come every day, but often enough that it became a thread in Walter's life. He'd shuffle into the kitchen, pour his coffee, and feel that tiny flicker of anticipation. Will she be there today? Some mornings, the concrete was empty, only the faint outline of paw prints in the dust, hinting that she'd passed through in the night. Other days, there she was, curled in that same spot, ears swiveling lazily as the sun crept over the fence. Inside, Marble and Rusty adjusted in their own way. At first, their tails puffed and their backs arched. But over time, the fear softened into curiosity. Marble would sit down in the patch of light that spilled through the glass, her body lined up almost perfectly with Clover's on the other side. Two cats from different worlds sharing the same warmth, separated by inches and a lifetime of different histories. These weren't dramatic encounters. They were small, repeatable moments, yet each one layered another strand of love and loyalty into Walter's days. A gentle reminder that connection can happen without touching, without speaking, without trying to tame what was never meant to be tamed. It wasn't just Walter's house that was changing. Down the street, neighbors began to notice that something was different. One afternoon, at the row of mailboxes baking in the sun, Evelyn Brooks turned to him with a puzzled smile. "Have you noticed?" she asked. "I used to hear rats in my walls every fall. This year, nothing." Another neighbor mentioned his garden hadn't been chewed up by night visitors for the first time in years. Someone else said they'd seen a beautiful wildcat slinking along the wash line at dusk and, strangely, felt less afraid of the dark after that. Most of them didn't know about the den under Walter's junipers. They didn't know about the cub he greeted every so often at his door, but they felt the effects of this bobcat family. Fewer pests, more balance, a subtle easing of that constant, low-level fight against small invaders. It was a living example of how moral stories about nature and kindness aren't always abstract. Sometimes they are literally walking through your neighborhood on quiet paws, doing the work you don't see. Word began to trickle out. Evelyn came over one evening with a plate of still warm cornbread. They sat at Walter's table, watching clips from his low-budget wildlife camera on the old laptop. Luna was guiding her cubs across the bridge he'd built. Bridger paced the fence line under the moon. Clover, bolder than the rest, wanders closer to the porch each week. Evelyn put a hand to her chest as Clover appeared on the screen, settled by the door, eyes reflecting the porch light. "She trusts you," Evelyn whispered. "Look at that. She could be anywhere, and she chose right there." Walter didn't claim any special gift. He just shook his head, eyes a little too bright. "I think she chose the quiet," he said. "Maybe that's what the wild looks for, same as us." The conversation didn't turn into a big speech about life and loss, but the meaning hung there between them. Two people who knew grief well, watching a small bobcat cub turn a slab of concrete into a place of meeting. It was a heartwarming story, told without anyone needing to explain it out loud. To make sure this closeness stayed safe, for the bobcats, for him, for the neighbors, Caleb, the wildlife officer, stopped by one more time. They walked the yard together, Caleb pointing out what Walter was already doing right. No food left outside, trash secured, cats kept indoors at dawn and dusk. Then, in a way that felt more like friendship than authority, Caleb shed a few gentle reminders. Let them come and go. Avoid hand-feeding, no matter how tempting it is to see them up close. Never try to touch. They need to stay wild, to stay safe. Those words turned into part of Walter's quiet code. It was a form of love, too, resisting the urge to make the wild into something it wasn't, allowing bobcats to remain bobcats, even while they left paw prints at his door. Over time, Clover's visits shaped more than just his mornings. He found himself lingering at the window with the TV off, listening to the softer sounds, the rustle of leaves, a quail calling in the distance, the faint thud of small paws jumping off the porch. He noticed how his own breathing slowed when he watched her, how the restless buzzing in his thoughts quieted down. It was like finding a gentle, living kind of meditation he never knew he needed. For some viewers, this might feel almost like a fairy tale. A bobcat cub and an old man sharing sunrises in the desert. But the deeper truth is simpler and maybe more inspirational. This was kindness moving both ways, between the domestic and the wild, between neighbors and the land, between a man who thought his life had shrunk and a family of animals slowly expanding his world again. The wild had come to his porch, not as a threat, but as an invitation to pay attention, to soften, to see his little corner of Arizona as part of something bigger and more connected. And the neighbors, without realizing it, were part of that too. Feeling safer, feeling grateful, feeling just a little less alone under the same sky. Soon, though, this peaceful balance would be tested. Storm season was returning. With it would come hard rain, slippery ground, and a moment when Walter's aging body and his devotion to this wild family would collide in a way that could have changed everything. In the next part, we'll walk with him into that storm, into the night when he slipped in the mud, when fear and exhaustion nearly made him turn away, and when his choice to keep going deepened this connection more than he could have imagined. And if you've ever found comfort just watching the world outside your own window, you may recognize a bit of your own heart in what happens when the clouds finally break. There are nights when a story almost ends without anyone knowing, not because the heart stops loving, but because the body reminds you it can't do what it used to do. For Walter, that night came with a storm. All afternoon, the sky over Pine Hollow had been building itself into something serious. Clouds stacked on the horizon like gray mountains, the kind that don't just drift by, they arrive with a plan. The weather radio hummed out a flash flood warning, the kind he'd half listened to 100 times before. This time, he listened differently. His eyes went to the back door, to the drainage ditch, to the corner where the junipers held their hidden den. He pictured Clover and her siblings tucked in there, the way he'd seen them on calm evenings, paws kneading dry dust, Luna stretched like a shield in front of them. "Not tonight," he murmured under his breath. "Not if I can help it." The first drops hit the roof like fingers drumming on a table. Marble slipped under the coffee table and Rusty took shelter on the couch. Walter stood at the glass, hand resting on the cool frame, watching as the sky opened up. Within minutes, his modest backyard transformed. The gravel shimmered under the downpour. The gentle slope toward the ditch started shining with running water, thin at first, then thickening into small streams. The simple wooden bridge he'd built a few weeks earlier, those 3 planks from the shed, sat directly in the path of it all. He could have told himself, they know what to do, they're wild, and that would have been true. But love and loyalty aren't always logical. Sometimes they're just the quiet refusal to sit in a warm kitchen while you know someone small and vulnerable might be in trouble outside. A high, sharp sound cut through the drum of the rain. Not a thunderclap, not a car alarm. A cry. Short, panicked, and unmistakably young. Walter didn't think after that. He pulled on his old jacket, slid his feet into the nearest shoes, and pushed open the door. The wall of rain hit his face with surprising force. The step was already slick. He gripped the doorframe, heart jumping in his chest, not just from the effort, but from the flash of understanding that this was no place for a man with pills on his counter and a doctor's warning still echoing in his memory. He went anyway. The air smelled like wet dust and creosote. Water streamed along the flagstones, turning the familiar path into something unfamiliar and uncertain. His knees complained with every step. The ground shifted slightly under his weight, mud rolling over the edges of his shoes. When he reached the fence, he could see it clearly now. The ditch behind the houses was running harder than he'd expected, carrying branches, trash, everything the storm could pry loose. And near the concrete lip, in a patch of rapidly shrinking high ground, a tiny spotted shape stood frozen, soaked to the skin. Ember. She'd grown since he first saw her, but next to that dark, moving water, she looked small again. Her paws slipped on the muddy slope as she tried to climb higher. Every slide sent her closer to the edge. Walter's breath shortened. It wasn't just the exertion. It was the knowledge settling into him like a stone. One wrong step for her, and this heartwarming story he'd been living could turn into one of those moral stories people tell in hushed voices about what might have been. He found the gate latch with numb fingers and forced it open. The slope down to the ditch had never seemed so steep. His foot hit the mud and skidded. He grabbed the chain link, muscles in his shoulder flaring with pain. Easy, he told himself. One step at a time. The rain blurred everything. He blinked hard, blinked again. He could hear his own breathing now, ragged and too loud. His chest tightened in a way that made some old, buried fear whisper, "This is how old men die. Alone in their yards with nobody watching." He set his jaw and took another step. Reaching the dirt near the ditch, he searched with his foot until he felt the edge of the wooden bridge. It was half submerged, but still there, still holding. He eased his weight onto it, feeling it shift but not give way. "Come on, sweetheart," he called over the water, voice rough. "Right here, over here." Ember's ears flicked. For a moment, she froze, eyes wide, rain flattening her fur to her narrow frame. Then instinct, or maybe something like trust, kicked in. Her paws churned through the mud. She slipped once, scrambled, and launched herself toward the board. She landed on the plank, claws scraping, body almost sliding off the side. Walter's hand shot out on reflex and hovered, stopping just short of touching her, respecting that last thin line between wild and human. His presence alone seemed to steady her. She dug in and ran the length of the bridge in 3 bounding steps, straight toward higher ground and the darkness beyond. As she vanished into the safety of the juniper shadows, Walter's body finally claimed its due. His left foot lost traction on the wet wood. The world tilted. He hit the ground hard, one knee slamming into the mud, a hot streak of pain shooting up his leg. The impact knocked the air out of him. For a second he lay there, rain pounding his face, heart hammering in a way that felt bigger and wilder than anything in front of him. Time stretched in that strange way it does when you're suddenly acutely aware of your own limits. You thought of Margaret, standing in this same yard years ago, insisting on kindness for stray cats. He thought of his daughter's voicemail, the one he hadn't returned. He thought of Clover on the porch, of Marble and Rusty waiting inside, of Luna and Bridger keeping their own sharp-eyed watch over the den. And he thought, clear as spoken words, "I'm not ready to leave this yet." He rolled onto his side, grabbed the nearest fence post, and slowly pulled himself up. Mud clung to his jacket, his hands, his shoes. His knee throbbed. His chest hurt in that deep, hollow way that makes you suddenly respectful of every beat. By the time he made it back to the porch, he was shaking, not from cold, but from the realization that his body had just drawn a line in the sand. He wasn't the invincible young soldier who could ignore warning signs anymore. If he wanted to keep practicing this quiet love and loyalty toward the bobcats, he was going to have to find a way that didn't cost him everything in one night. The next day, a nurse wrapped a cuff around his arm at the clinic and gave him that look older folks know, half stern, half concerned. "You've got to respect your limits, Mr. Hayes," she said gently. "We need you around a while longer." That afternoon, back at his kitchen table, Walter stared at his open notebook. The page was still marked with yesterday's entry. Storm coming in. Cubs seen near den. Bridge holding. He picked up his pen and added a new line. Ember crossed in the rain. So did I. He sat with that for a long time. This could have been the moment he pulled back emotionally, closed the curtains more, told himself, I got too involved. It's safer not to care this much. A lot of people do that after a scare. They mistake caution for withdrawal, safety for shutting down. Instead, later that evening, he did something small and quietly defiant. He filled the big ceramic water bowl, walked it to the far edge of the yard where the fence met the junipers, and set it down carefully. His knee reminded him of every step. His heart beat a little too hard, but his hands were steady. He wasn't feeding the bobcats. He'd listened to Caleb's guidance. He wasn't trying to make them tame. He was just making sure that when storms came and the ditch ran high, there would be one more safe place for a thirsty creature to drink. In that decision, something shifted inside him. He began to see his age, his scars, his pills, not as disqualifiers, but as proof that this inspirational story wasn't about being strong all the time. It was about showing up again after a fall, about practicing kindness with whatever you have left, even if what you have left looks smaller than it used to. It was a new kind of fairy tale, not one where the hero never gets hurt, but one where he keeps choosing love and loyalty even when the path is muddy and his footing isn't what it was. The storm passed, the desert dried, Ember and her siblings grew bolder. Clover kept appearing on the porch, sometimes with a little more size, a little more confidence. Each visit a reminder that life moves forward, whether we feel ready or not. And soon, as the season quietly turned, Walter would face the moment no amount of training prepares you for. The day the ones you've watched over stand in front of you one last time, and then choose their own path. In the next part, we'll stand beside him in the cool early light as Luna and the cubs line up in the yard for a farewell that says more than any words could. It's a scene that might stir some of your own memories, the goodbyes that broke your heart and healed it in the same breath. If you've ever come close to walking away from something you love because the risk of caring felt too big, this next chapter may feel especially close to home. Some goodbyes are so quiet, you could almost pretend they're not happening. But sometimes, the quiet ones are the ones that split you open the most. By the time autumn settled over Pine Hollow, the rhythm of Walter's life and the bobcat's life had become strange twins of each other. Mornings began with coffee and Clover's occasional visits to the porch. Evenings ended with a last glance toward the junipers, a small check to see who was out, who was playing, who was learning to stalk in the long shadows. The storm that nearly took Ember, and nearly took more from Walter than he wanted to admit, had passed. The earth had dried. His knees still complained when the weather turned, but the bridge held. The cubs crossed it with the easy confidence of young things that don't yet know how close danger has come to them. Day by day, they grew into themselves. Clover's steps lengthened. Birch moved with a measured certainty. Piper's restless, chattering energy found focus in real hunts. Moss could vanish into a patch of grass and reappear 2 yards away like a little ghost. Ember, once stranded in the floodwater, moved now with a new steadiness, as if she'd learned something deep in her bones about where to place her feet. Walter watched these changes with the same attention some people reserve for sports scores or stock prices. His notebook was filled with small notes. Piper brought in the first mouse. Luna watched but didn't interfere. Clover climbed the fence, sat like a queen on top. Young males scent-marked closer to houses. Bridger pushed him back out. He could hear the year turning, even if he didn't look at the calendar. The air was cool in the mornings. The light came later. The smell of the desert changed. Less hot dust, more something dry and sweet that hinted at winter coming. He'd read enough now, talked to Caleb enough to know what that meant. Bobcat families don't stay together forever. The cubs grow, disperse, and find their own territories. The tight little circle that had formed right behind his fence was never meant to be permanent. Knowing it in his head didn't do much to soften what his heart felt. It happened on a Tuesday. He didn't remember why he woke earlier than usual. Maybe it was his knee. Maybe it was the restless kind of sleep that comes when you've lived long enough to have a lot to think about at 3 in the morning. Whatever the reason, he found himself standing in the dark kitchen, watching the coffee maker blink to life. Something pulled him toward the back door before the machine even finished its quiet dripping. He slid the curtain aside and felt his chest tighten. They were all there. Not scattered along the fence line, not hidden under the junipers. Luna and the 5 cubs stood in the open center of the yard, arranged in a loose half-circle, facing the house. Bridger lingered in the shadows near the far corner, watchful, but still. The first pale light of morning laid a thin gold edge on their fur. Their breaths showed faintly in the cool air. The world beyond them was still, the way the world sometimes gets right before a storm, or just before a big truth settles in. Walter stepped closer to the glass. Marble appeared at his ankle. Rusty joined a heartbeat later. The 3 of them stood together, the old man and his house cats, looking out at the wild family that had quietly become part of their own. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Luna did something he'd never seen her do in all those months. She lay down. Not to lounge, not to nap. She folded her legs under her, spine straight, head high, still facing the house. One by one, the cubs followed her lead, sinking into the grass in an imperfect but earnest line. All eyes turned toward the sliding door. It looked, for all the world, like a kind of ceremony. Not human, not planned in any way he could explain, but undeniably deliberate. Walter's throat tightened. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He'd held himself together like a soldier, shaking hands and thanking people for casseroles he never ate. Back then, it had felt like the only way to stay upright. Now, watching this line of bobcats settled in his yard as the sky slowly brightened around them, he felt the familiar burn at the back of his eyes and didn't push it down. He didn't know what this was exactly. He only knew what it felt like. It felt like a goodbye. The minutes stretched. The light crept higher. Somewhere, a bird started its morning call. A truck moved quietly on the distant highway. In the middle of it all, his little patch of ground held a stillness so complete, it almost hurt. He watched the cub's flanks rise and fall. He saw the way Luna's ears flicked at each small sound, but her gaze never left the house. He wondered what they saw when they looked at that rectangle of glass. Did they see the man who had carried their kin out of the ditch? The one who built the bridge? The one who refilled the water when storms took more than they gave? Or did they just see movement, shadow, warmth? In a way, it didn't matter. Love doesn't always need names to know it's there. After what felt like a long shared breath, Luna stood. No drama, no lingering. She rose as the decision had already been made a long time ago, and now it was just time for feet to follow. Birch stood next, then Moss, then Piper. Each took a step toward the far corner of the yard, toward the gap under the fence Walter had once thought about fixing and never did. That small act of procrastination had become a passageway. Ember rose too, pausing a moment longer near the little bridge, her nose lowering to sniff the wood before she moved on. A quiet thank you, maybe. Or maybe just habit. To Walter, it felt like both. Clover stayed. She remained seated as her siblings walked away, eyes still fixed on the glass. When Luna turned to go, Clover finally stood. But instead of following immediately, she moved closer to the house. 5 steps, then 3 more. She stopped just short of the place where his sticky note once clung to the door. The glass held only a faint outline now, where the paper's edges had shielded it from dust and sun. Walter could see that square as clearly as he saw her. They were only a few feet apart. He could see the details now. The pattern of her spots, the way one whisker curved slightly out of line, the calm steadiness in her eyes. No panic, no pleading, just a full, unflinching look from a creature who had once slept outside his door as he drank his morning coffee. He could have stayed silent. That had been his habit through so many losses, keeping the biggest truths tucked down where they wouldn't trouble anyone. This time, the words rose and didn't stop. "I didn't think I'd get to love anything this much again," he whispered. He didn't say it for her. He said it for himself. For Margaret. For the part of him that had quietly decided, after the funeral and the lonely holidays and the unanswered voicemails, that his heart should be on light duty for the rest of the time he had left. Clover blinked slowly, the way cats do when they feel safe. The tip of her tail flicked once. Then, without any rush, She turned, trotted across the yard, and slipped under the fence after her family. Bridger followed last, a silent shadow. And just like that, the yard was empty again. The quiet that rushed in afterward was different from the one that had filled his house before the bobcats ever arrived. That earlier silence had been heavy, like something missing. This one was full. Heavy, yes, but with meaning instead of just absence. Walter's cheeks were wet. Marble and Rusty pressed in close, as if drawn to the warmth radiating off him. He rested a hand on each of their backs and let himself feel all of it. The grief, the gratitude, the strange, bittersweet happiness that this love, this kindness, this unlikely fairy tale had happened at all. He stood there for a long time, watching the place where tales had disappeared under metal and rust and dust. No speeches, What he didn't know yet was that this wasn't the end of the story. The Wild family had left, but their paw prints remained. In the dirt, in his notebook, in the final part of this story, we'll step out of Walter's yard and see how the truth of what happened there spreads down the street, into other kitchens, onto other porches. We'll see what happened when he finally shared his footage, when his daughter watched from another state, and when a community realized they'd all been quietly blessed by a bobcat family they never really met. The ending of this story might offer a kind of comfort that lingers long after the screen goes dark. Some truths don't arrive with breaking news or flashing lights. They come in slowly, through old footage and small conversations, until one day, an entire street realizes they've all been living inside the same quiet miracle. After the farewell under the junipers, Walter's world didn't snap back to normal. The yard was still there, the coffee still brewed, Marble and Rusty still claimed the warmest spots in the house. But the air felt different, as if the months with the bobcat family had opened a window he didn't want to close again. For a while, he couldn't bear to touch the recordings. Dozens of little video clips sat on his old laptop and backup drives. Clover on the porch, Ember on the bridge, Luna leading her cubs through the moonlight. But he left them alone, the way you leave flowers pressed between pages for a future day when your heart is ready. Life moved along in small, ordinary ways. His knee slowly healed from the storm, the weather cooled. The holidays came and went, with a few polite phone calls and a couple of neighborly plates of cookies. One chilly evening, Evelyn stopped by with soup and a question. "Have you watched any of it yet?" she asked, nodding toward the laptop. Walter shook his head, eyes on his hands. "Not sure I'm ready to miss them twice." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What if you don't watch it alone?" That simple offer, spoken at a worn kitchen table under a buzzing ceiling light, changed everything. They set the laptop between them and pressed play. At first, the images felt almost too tender to look at. There were the cubs, when they were still wobbly, tumbling over each other in the dust. There was Luna teaching them how to freeze, how to listen, how to move. There was Bridger on the fence line, a silent guardian. And there was Clover, tiny and brave, curled against the glass while Walter's coffee steamed just out of frame. Evelyn laughed softly at Piper's awkward first pounce, wiped her eyes at Ember's muddy, storm-soaked dash across the bridge, shook her head in wonder at the loyalty and love playing out in that small backyard. These were heartwarming stories inside one larger, unexpected, inspirational story. And they were real. No fairy tales, no special effects. Just a wild family and an old man trying to practice kindness on the little piece of earth he'd been given. At some point, Evelyn's hand found his on the table and stayed there. "You know," she said quietly, "I thought I was done feeling this much about anything." Walter understood. Sitting there, watching the bobcats move through seasons, he realized these weren't just animal clips. They were proof that his life still had a pulse that matched the world outside his walls. Proof that love and loyalty were not things he'd left behind in younger years, but things still moving through him in quieter ways. A few days later, he did something he'd put off for far too long. He called his daughter, not to talk about his health or finances or practical details, but to talk about a bobcat, named Clover. He sent a short video, just 30 seconds, of Clover and Marble on opposite sides of the glass, sharing that morning sunlight as if it belonged to both of them. There was a long pause after she watched it. He could hear people moving in the background, the noise of a busy life far from his quiet street. And then her voice broke just a little as she said, "Dad, I didn't know you had this. I didn't know you still felt this much." They talked longer that night than they had in years. Not about everything, not all at once, but the door cracked open to memories of Margaret, to his stories of the army, to his days on the porch with the Wild family that had seen him through a hard stretch of grief. In another state, in another kitchen, his grown daughter showed the clip to her co-workers. A few of them cried in that tired, grateful way people do when they see a bit of kindness in a world that often feels harsh. They weren't just reacting to a bobcat. They were reacting to the reminder that aging doesn't mean you stop having emotions that run deep and soulful. That night, when Walter went out to take the trash to the curb, he found something on his front step. A small cluster of desert wildflowers, arranged more carefully than the wind could manage. No note, no explanation. Just a quiet thank you in color and petals. The next time Caleb organized a community meeting about local wildlife, he asked if he could show some of Walter's footage. In the small Pine Hollow library, folding chairs filled up with people who had lived side by side for years without really knowing each other. Walter sat near the back, cap in his hands, as the projector hummed to life. On the screen, Luna moved through the tall grass. The cubs tumbled on the bridge. Clover approached the porch. There were little gasps, soft laughs, the kind of silence that settles when a whole room feels the same thing at once. Caleb kept his words simple. This bobcat family had reduced rodent problems, protected gardens, and reminded everyone that their town was still part of a living landscape, not just a map of property lines. He explained how Walter had respected the bobcat's wildness. No feeding, no hands, just steady, thoughtful care in removing dangers and giving space. Then something unexpected happened. Neighbors began to stand up and speak. One admitted she'd started coming outside at dusk just to see if she could catch a glimpse of the bobcats, and that those 10-minute walks had done more for her loneliness than she could say. Another joked that his tomatoes had never been happier, then grew serious, and said he felt oddly safe knowing a wild family was out there, doing their work while everyone slept. Someone else mentioned that during a particularly anxious season of life, watching those short clips of bobcats in Walter's yard had helped him breathe again. As people talked, Walter realized the truth that had slipped in under the radar. By choosing love over fear, by practicing quiet kindness instead of control, he hadn't just changed his own life. He'd quietly helped heal his whole street. Not in some dramatic, overnight way, but in the slow, steady way that moral stories about everyday courage often unfold. The bobcats had eaten the mice, but they'd also eaten away at something else. The numbness, the disconnection, the belief that nothing beautiful or unexpected could happen here anymore. The secret that left the street in tears wasn't just that an old man had rescued bobcat cubs in his backyard. It was that, in doing so, he'd rescued a piece of everyone's hope. He'd shown that kindness doesn't expire with age, that love can take new forms when old ones feel out of reach, and that loyalty to a place, to its creatures, to each other, still matters. Seasons kept turning. One spring morning, new paw prints appeared in the dust by the porch. Slightly different pattern, slightly different stride, but unmistakably bobcat. When Walter looked up, he saw her, an adult cat. Familiar spots on her leg, familiar calm in her eyes. Clover, grown. Behind her, 3 small shapes tumbled and tripped their way toward the junipers. Life had come full circle, as if the desert itself had decided this little backyard was a good place for love to keep circling back. Watching her lead her own cubs to the den, Walter understood something he'd never put into words before. He didn't need a perfect ending to feel happy. He needed continuity, a sense that kindness, once set in motion, would keep moving even when he couldn't. Standing on that porch, hand lightly resting on the door, He felt less like a man nearing the end of a story and more like someone who had become part of an ongoing, soulful tale between humans and wild creatures, sharing the same thin slice of earth. As you listen to this, maybe a part of you is thinking about your own version of Pine Hollow, your own backyard, your own habits that might have turned into walls. Maybe there's a corner of your life where you can soften just a little. Notice more. Offer a bit of quiet kindness to a neighbor, to an animal, to a piece of land, or even to yourself. These are the heartwarming stories that don't hit the headlines, but they are the ones that stay with us. The old man who found a second life through bobcats, the wild family that trusted a human who had every reason to give up on love, but didn't. If this story has touched something in you, if it's reminded you of your own capacity for loyalty, for gentleness, for new beginnings at any age, I'd invite you to sit with that feeling for a moment. Ask yourself, what small act of kindness can I offer to the living world around me this week? And if you'd like more stories like this, quiet, real, and made to heal, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might need a gentle reminder that hope is still out there. If you feel called to go one step further, your warm super thanks or donation helps support real efforts to rescue and heal wild animals like bobcats, giving them a chance to live their own stories of survival and grace. However you choose to carry this forward, thank you for being here, for listening with your heart, and for believing that even the softest acts of kindness still matter.